The day dawned cold, with the sun shyly peeking through the clouds, not strong enough to warm the nearly frozen fingers of the Ukrainian. The frozen ground of the trench didn't help him. Even so, he laughed when he saw the theft. Bakhmut was the hell that God froze on earth. There, the corpses piled up to the point where there weren't enough angels or demons to carry the souls. The wounded were taken to hospitals by the hundreds, while the bombs kept falling. The city was practically a corpse. It was so lifeless that its buildings were mere skeletons that, from time to time, struggled. They filled with smoke with each new explosion. Inside them, Ukrainians waited for the Russians, who pressed through the blocks, paying in souls, a toll for every house they occupied. 100 meters exchanged for a dozen corpses, 24 wounded, and memories of terror for those who survived. The trenches in the region froze during the winter. The cold killed just as much as when she had to look for ways to keep warm and stay well fed. A trench was flooded and turned into pure mud. The sleepy soldier turned over in his sleep into that cold mud. He woke up startled, unable to breathe, his arms sinking even deeper when he tried to get up. The men pulled him out of that desperate situation and left him dirty and terrified, catching their breath when they heard the sound of the first mortar. Before the story of the almost drowned man could spread through the trench, the gears of the meat grinder started to move. It was so well oiled that it made little noise before the Russians began to advance. The Ukrainians raised the PKM and the Zaka. Nearby, some men were speaking in English, saying it was time for cheap meat. It finally came. The Russian was young. He got the news about the mobilization, grabbed his maca, and was sent to the battlefield with dreams of fighting. He arrived the day before, hearing absurd things like people without training or soldiers refusing to fight. He simply took his weapon that morning, joined the newcomers, and followed orders toward the trench. The artillery was exploding, providing covering fire as they started to run. At his side, an even younger boy had eyes wide with fear. He came from Buryatia, one of the poorest republics in the Federation. The Russian heard running beside him. His AK-47 hung low, his mouth open, exhaling hot air. The boy suddenly dropped, pierced by a 7.62 round when the trench machine gun started to roar. But the eyes of the men fell as the venomous sound of the PKM continued. The Russian ran as the trench drew nearer. He raised his AK. But then, 60mm mortar rounds dropped like a gift onto the old man's head right in front of him. The Russian fell to the ground stunned. And there he lay for a long time on the frozen ground, smelling the scent of fresh death and hearing the last groans of the dying. He stayed quiet until he heard the footsteps of new soldiers and the sound of tanks. Someone picked him up, handed him his weapon, and pointed him toward the trench again. He looked at the soldier. He looked like a character from Call of Duty. He wore a plate carrier full of pouches for the magazines of an AK-53 with a red dot sight. The helmet was very different from that Soviet helmet the young man used to wear. The patches of the flag, blue, red, and white. The blue, red, and white flag patches and the skull patch made the recruit proud. The special forces were there to save him. The T-72 tank provided cover, lashing the trench with 125mm fire, kicking up dirt and knocking down bodies. The BMP-2 came with a squad that quickly dismounted, moving behind the armored vehicles and beginning to enter the trenches. The young Russian gathered his courage and went along, until he saw the chaos. The Ukrainians knew that this was when the difficulties began. The soft flesh had been hammered until it turned into fragments scattered on the ground. The tough muscle, which couldn't be torn by teeth, came right after, knowing where the main defenses of the trench were. The Ukrainian soldier saw an explosion up ahead. He almost lost his concentration when he heard a scream. But he recovered in time to see a young man appear just above him in a Soviet helmet, firing. He pointed the AK-74 at the Russian's head and fired. The projectile pierced the protection like paper. Blood ran and the body rolled down the trench. The Russian pressure was too strong. The PKTM above the BMP-2 was spewing fragments of aggression. The soldier didn't know who the attack was from. Well, probably it was the mercenaries, using their mix of newly hired troops at the front and the elite hardened by the wars in Syria coming right behind. But there were also separatists from Donetsk and Luhansk fighting in the region, not to mention the regular Russian troops. Finally, the best trained and prepared Russian troops entered the trench. The Ukrainian soldiers were succumbing. As the brutal tide invaded the paths from that point on, some ended up surrendering, faced with soldiers armed with gunpowder, steel, and motivation. The soldier crouched down, blending into the mud. He ran while crouching, retreating over the bodies of his comrades. A sad day when they were forced to swallow their pride and retreat. A living soldier fights the next day. The Russians took over several trenches. To the east of Bakhmut, the drones could see everything, watching the preparations as recruits dug the trenches like desperate ants. The Ukrainians watched and waited. Patience is sometimes everything in war. The soldiers finally took their eyes off the screen to signal the HIMARS. The missiles were the first warning that the fighting would not be easy. The impact consumed the future of some soldiers, but it didn't stop the trenches from being dug. The work continued day by day. The squad then got close enough to use an Israeli weapon. The M971 mortar was rarely seen outside its country of manufacture. But the Russians experienced the action of that weapon when the ammunition dispersed in the air, flooding the trench with a tide of death. The Ukrainian drone flew through the trench lines after the explosions. Seeing wounded men crawling, the camera ended the horror film and only returned to the Russian positions the next day. All the bodies were still lying there in the same place. The only difference was that all the wounded had now joined the death toll. The Russians pressed on with their special forces. There were mercenaries, but the regular army wouldn't be far behind. They felt ridiculed and protested when they saw the recruitment ads that offered little more than the promise of looting. After that, they went into combat, showing that money doesn't buy courage. They went through the neighborhoods of Bakhmut, clearing the way first with mortars 2B25. Which exploded in the houses on the outskirts where the Ukrainians were still resisting. They pressured the enemies with AK-74 gunfire or with 545 ammo from the AK-12. Some used the AKS-74U, much shorter and better suited to clearing confined spaces or fighting in the regular corners formed by the rubble. The pressure worked. Corpses were left on the street and were collected as consolidated positions were reported to command. Mortars were repositioned to keep breaking the skeletons of the buildings and burying the opponents. Inside the basements, the few civilians who refused to be evacuated by the Ukrainians were hiding, many of them pro-Russian, waiting while they listened to the bombs exploding over their heads. And the Ukrainians knew when they needed to retreat, but they also understood what it meant to wait and use their defenses. The snipers waited. One of them heard the sound of a machine gun suppressing the Ukrainian positions to allow the enemy to advance. A succession of shots silenced the weapon as the Russians were advancing with little protection on the streets. The Ukrainians raised their heads, aimed their weapons, and started taking them down. The Russians were left scattered on the ground or retreated. The fighting dragged on throughout the day. The troops advanced between the houses under shelling and gunfire, knowing that just defending was not enough. They had to counterattack or they would be engulfed by the Russian tide. They passed through backyards where children had played almost a year ago, hearing the sound of gunfire instead of children's laughter. They talked about enemy positions on the streets where neighbors used to meet to share the day's news. Night fell and darkness took over the empty streets. The silence was broken only by Russian artillery, which served as a reminder that peace had not yet arrived. In December 2022, in a cold that slowly sucked the warmth from bodies and froze the corpses, President Volodymyr Zelensky visited Bakhmut. He was greeted jubilantly by the soldiers. He handed out medals to the fighters and received back a signed flag, a symbol of the sacrifice for the defense of the city. On the other side, the owner of a mercenary company sent a video claiming he was in the region, and he waited. And he was waiting to confront the opposing leader. Meanwhile, the Russian president was in grand halls with other politicians seeking more support for the war. The three would see the winter pass, the temperature change, but the hell called Bakhmut would persist, with many wondering about the strategy and motives behind the fight for the region. But far fewer people questioned the terror of death. What happened? What happened? Well, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. This video is based on war reports, more precisely from the period of October to December of 2022. I didn't specify the fighters who were participating, the brigades, or the groups themselves very often, because I wanted to keep it a bit more general. For example, there are records mainly of the Wagner group, who are the main Russian participants in this offensive. And other groups are also participating, like the separatists from Luhansk and Donetsk. But we also have indications of Russian mobilized troops present in the region and others from the Russian army as well, really. There are some videos that I actually used to put this together, which are said to be from the Russian Special Forces. But I even did an analysis in another video of mine where there's a patch that looks like a Wagner patch, but it's not exactly the Wagner group patch, so it's hard to tell. I didn't want to keep mentioning and talking too much about the Wagner group because I've already talked a lot about the group in other videos. And I wanted to approach it differently here, how the fighting in Bakhmut unfolded, how other troops participated. I thought that would be important. I hope you enjoyed it. Let's see how the war progresses. Depending on how things go, there might be another video about this, but I'm not going to promise anything. Let's wait and see what happens. But this video was entirely based on war reports, all based on soldiers' accounts, mainly from the book Barrel and Beers. Very cool, because the author, he went to Ukraine, talked to Russians, talked to Ukrainians, did interviews and collected these stories. Very cool. I'm showing the book cover here, guys. I really recommend you read it. It's really, really good, and all these stories. I'm going to use it to tell a few more stories. I'm changing the text because I'm not going to reread passages from the book here, because you have to read the book. Guys, you have to read this great book, so I'm not just going to reread it. I take the stories and put them together, so you can understand what happened in the region, how the battles went, as in the case of Bakhmut now. So, I wrote this text myself. It's based on real accounts, things that really happened, reported by Russian soldiers, by Ukrainian soldiers, and that's it. I hope you liked it. Please share this video, leave a big like, leave a comment. This is very important to me, okay? We also have a Telegram channel for the channel members. I go there and post several of the images, even the ones I use here in full, and I also make some comments about them. It's not a complete analysis, but I explain what's true, what's false in each part, and where the information comes from. But it's a group only for channel members. If you want to become a channel member, you're very welcome. And you'll be offering support, which is important because it takes a lot of work to make these videos. That's it, guys. Hugs to everyone.